Good morning, everyone. All right, as I get this all set up, how are we doing this morning? All right, I hope you guys are good. The weather has been a little crazy here, really all across the country, but I'm hoping the storms and this cold front didn't hit you guys too hard. If you're new here this morning, welcome. We're also glad that you're here, and we'd love to get the opportunity to know you better, so welcome. And in case I haven't met you yet, I want to introduce myself real quick. My name is Manny Semidey. I'm not a pastor here at Denton North Church. I'm not on staff in any way. I just attend and serve this community however I can. I went to UT Dallas though. Whoosh. Yeah, there we go. I was part of Focus, the college ministry there for several years before getting married and moving here to Denton. And I can't believe that I think it's this month, it's already been 6 years since I've been here. It flies by. But I'm honored to have the opportunity to share a message with our church today because this is a community that I care so much about and want to continue to invest myself in. So we've been currently in a sermon series on 1st and 2nd Samuel, and over the last few months, we spent a lot of time in the book of 1st Samuel. Right now, we're at 1 Samuel chapter 31, which is the last chapter before we move on to 2 Samuel. And at this point, for a recap, I'd essentially be summarizing like the whole book of 1 Samuel. If this was a TV series, it wouldn't be like last week on 1 Samuel. It would be like this season on 1 Samuel, because so much has already happened in this story already, and this chapter really does feel like a finale episode. And with that said, there's a lot to recap, but it's crucial to understand where we are in this moment of the story. It's kind of like if I told you to watch Severance, and you couldn't jump into the season finale that just recently happened with actually knowing what's gone on so far. You'd be so lost. And all this talk of like innie and outie would make you think that you're watching a show about belly buttons. Like, you'd never listen to a show from me again. But let's get the full context of this story, of what's happened so far in 1 Samuel. So I'll kind of summarize it, but there should be some bullet points, So God raised up Samuel in response to Hannah's prayer and used Samuel to lead Israel as a prophet. But Israel wanted a king, like all the other nations around them, even though God was supposed to be their one true king. God allowed it and anointed Saul, who started strong but became disobedient and self-reliant. Meanwhile, God chose David to eventually replace him. Saul spent much of his reign trying to kill David out of jealousy and ignoring God's voice and counsel from Samuel. As the Philistines prepare to attack, Saul finds himself desperate, terrified, and without guidance from God. In defiance of God's law, he turns to a medium, which is a big no-no in the Torah. And Samuel's spirit tells him plainly that God has turned away from him and that his end is near. And that's where we've left off. That's the recap. So let's read together. I just started my timer because I'm trying not to go over. But let's read together this story in 1 Samuel 31. So if you can, turn your Bibles to that point and we'll read together. I'll have some the scriptures on the slide too if you want to follow there, but I'll be reading from the CSB version. All right, let's jump in. So the Philistines fought against Israel, and Israel's men fled from them. Many were killed on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons and killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. When the battle intensified against Saul, the archers caught up with him and severely wounded him. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through with it, or these uncircumcised men will come and run me through and torture me." But his armor-bearer would not do it, because he was terrified. Then Saul took his sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. So on that day, Saul died together with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men. When the men of Israel on the other side of the valley and on the other side of the Jordan saw that Israel's men had run away, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled too. So the Philistines came and settled in them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons dead on Mount Gilboa. They cut off Saul's head, stripped off his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to spread the good news in the temples of their idols and among their people. Then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashereths and hung his body on the wall of Bethshan. When the residents of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their brave men set out, journeyed all night, and retrieved the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons that were on the wall of Bethshan. When they arrived at Jabesh, they burned the bodies there. Afterwards, they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted for 7 days. So here we are. Saul has died. Consider how you're feeling after reading that. And I think that it should feel a bit complex. I feel like there's a few different emotions that we could be feeling right now. For me at least, whenever I read this, I feel some pensiveness, I feel disappointment, grief, judgment and disapproval of Saul, frustrated and irritated with Saul, but also hopeful for what's next. But I also acknowledge that that's because I know the rest of the story and how it's going to go. But even if I didn't know, and I was in ancient Israel right now, and just knowing what happened in the rest of 1 Samuel, I would know that God has already been at work and has been a few steps ahead at this point. He has a bigger plan in mind.
Yeah, that's good.
And I'll be honest, I had to use one of those emotion wheels, like the color wheels, to figure out my emotions. I'm still learning how to name those. But I think it was really good exercise for this chapter.
Yeah.
Because it's a complicated mixture of emotions. And as we've said in the beginning of the sermon series, this is a complex narrative with very morally ambiguous characters. And this chapter concludes a significant moment in this biblical storyline, and it's a significant moment of Israel's history. It's a tragic end that's mixed with mixed emotions, but it serves a redemptive purpose. It's a warning to us not to repeat Saul's mistakes. It's a cautionary tale, and we should dig into this tale a little bit more. So I'll go through the story a little bit in more detail, just so that we can understand the gravity of what's going on here. So in the beginning, we see at this point, the Philistines have been enemies of God's people and been at war with Israel for many, many generations. And one of Saul's main tasks from the beginning was to take care of this Philistine army because they've been causing so much turmoil to Israel at this point. And Saul's negligence and disobedience to Yahweh, built up over years of ignoring God's commands, has finally caught up to him at this point. The Philistines brought their units together into one big army to move against Israel. And we're not really told why the Philistines did this. It's not really clear in the Bible. But I think that the Philistines likely saw Israel's leadership crumbling and seized the chance to strike. And Saul's army held the higher ground. They were up in the mountains. And this advantage should have helped him. Plus, weren't they God's people after all? But we see that the Philistines completely overpowered Israel. They outright dominated the battle from the start. And there was so much death here. They were so overwhelmed that there wasn't much that the Israel men could even do, other than to retreat and run for their lives. And those were the ones who could make it out alive. A large chunk of their military men and their military leaders died in this battle. Saul's own sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, Malchishua, were among those who had died as well. And Jonathan's death is especially tragic. There's a lot that we could go into just in the fact that Jonathan died here. Because this is David's closest friend, a good man, and next in line to the throne, if we were going by the oldest, with the king, though we know that David was the one that was anointed. his loss shows just how devastating this battle was. Because normally in battles, like these are really important people, were protected. Like they were not at the risk of as much of a risk in the battle, even though that they were also warriors, because they were such important people. This just highlights how overwhelmingly successful these Philistines were in this battle, and how unprepared the Israel army seemed in contrast. They were able to get so close enough that they rained down arrows onto their army and strike the most important people representing Israel. Then we get to Saul's death. And I wonder if Saul witnessed the death of his sons. Like, I'm sure that they were close by. And I feel awful thinking about what that could have been like for him. We know he was already terrified of the Philistines' army just a few days before and was desperately looking for help. He had the final prophecy of Samuel's spirit validating his fear and telling him that his army, his sons, and he would all die. Now he's living that moment out and seeing his men and his sons dying alongside him. Just like his sin, the archers caught up to Saul. And he was also hit by this downpour of arrows, and this wound was fatal. Saul knows that he's dying. He sees the Philistines coming and closing in on him as the blood's gushing out of his body, and he knows that what these Philistines are capable of. We see just in Judges, in the book of Judges, what they did to Samson whenever they captured him. So he knows that they're capable of torturing their enemies. So he asks his armor bearer, this poor armor bearer, to take his life instead so that he doesn't meet the same fate as Samson. And the armor bearer is a position held by someone of the utmost loyalty to the king. But Yahweh's anointed king of Israel just asked him, this armor bearer, to kill the said king. Who should determine the fate of God's chosen king but God himself? This poor guy, of course, he couldn't do it. And once Saul fell on his sword and died, so did the armor bearer's hope of getting out of this mess alive. He followed this king into the same fate, though his death was undeserving. This was a very underwhelming end to Saul's underwhelming time as a king. Falling on his sword may have been maybe seen as a cowardly act, but be honest, do you think in that moment that you would choose the humiliation and the slow, painful, torturous death at the hand of your enemies? I don't think so. I also think that taking the king of Israel alive and eventually torturing him into this slow and painful death would probably haunt Israel. That's a terrible image. It would not be a good look for God's people. This battle of Mount Gilboa was so lopsided that they couldn't even come back and dare to try to rescue the bodies of Saul and his sons. When the Philistines came back to loot the battlefield and of the spoils of war, they were able to bring back the best trophy, Saul, the king of Israel, the king of their enemy. And even though Saul isn't alive, he gets his body humiliated anyways. So the news of Saul's death was so different for the Philistines versus Israel. For the Philistines, we see that this battle was great news. This is a historic victory for their nation. They spread the news fast among their people, likely shouting out, "The king of Israel is dead. Look here, we have his head." As they celebrate, they behead Saul, stripped him of his armor, and distribute these pieces like trophies around their towns. They're throwing a huge party to celebrate this. And we actually see in 1 Chronicles 10 that Saul's skull ends up in the temple of Dagon, which we just heard about in Samuel chapter 5, where years earlier, Dagon's statue had bowed down before the Ark of the Covenant. Now Saul lies broken, where God had once showed his power. What used to be a sign of God's victory now feels like a moment of defeat. But we know that this isn't Dagon's win. It's a symbol of Saul's fall and God's judgment on Saul. To the rest of Israel, the battle was devastating news. This is a historic loss for the nation. The nearby Israelite cities, located in the opposite part of the valley where the battle occurred, they were terrified. and had no choice but to run for their lives as well. Israel is now going backwards in the plan that God had for them. Instead of driving out the people from the promised land and keeping it, they're now being driven out of their land and their homes in the promised land. They're fleeing for their own safety, knowing how dangerous the Philistines were, because they were quickly advancing towards them. As they're leaving behind their family and all the things that they own to save their own lives, they're leaving behind this significant portion that God has blessed them with. Saul didn't just fail God as king, he failed to take care and protect the people of God. Then we get to this rescue mission of the story, where we see that one city of Israel had a very different reaction to what happened at the Battle of Mount Gilboa. When the news of the battle reached Jabesh Gilead, they didn't flee. And to be fair, they're at a different part geographically, but it's still worth noting the contrast of their reaction. Why did they have such a different response to this battle? Well, back in Samuel 11, we read a story about how Saul saved this town of Jabesh Gilead from being conquered and tortured by then the king of Ammon named Nahash. So I imagine that they were devastated to hear this news of Saul's death and the mocking display of his body. They remember Saul as a hero, a great king of Israel who was filled by the Spirit of God and delivered their people from a dangerous situation that they were experiencing. This is one of the last times that Saul showed good leadership and obedience to God. Saul was worth honor and respect to them. And they were so moved by this news, they sent their best and bravest men on a risky stealth mission, traveling many, many miles to go overnight into a heavily guarded, hostile Philistine territory to retrieve their war trophies. These weren't afterthought pieces. These were trophies to them. And when they got back, they continued to honor Saul and his sons by burning off the flesh of their likely mutilated and defiled bodies. Remember, at this point, Saul doesn't even have a head. And they gave them a proper burial of their bones and grieved them by fasting for 7 days. Though Saul died an underwhelming but fitting death and was humiliated by the Philistines, he was still treated with honor and dignity by these people because they were blessed by the good Saul, a king with promise and a king that was filled with the Spirit of God. So what can we learn from this story, this super tragic, sad story? Well, I think it's a cautionary tale where the downfall and death of Saul is the main thing to reflect on here. There's a lot that we can really learn about the story of Saul that makes this story so rich. But my main point that I have is that when we oppose God through sin, we hurt others, we miss out on his blessings that he has for us, and we separate ourselves from a good and faithful Father. This, to me, really encapsulates the main point here. So I'll dig into each of this a little bit. Starting off with the fact that our sin doesn't just hurt us. I think the armor bearer in this story is a great representation of this. He was loyal to Saul to the end, and the king's missteps along the way led to his death. We see how Saul's failure as king led to a massive blow to Israel's army and the many families that were settled here in the Promised Land. So let's consider how your sin affects others. How might your sin be hurting the people around you? How might your negligence be impacting your roommate? Your lust hurt your spouse? Your selfishness hurt your family? Your pride affect your neighbor? Our sin isn't just between us and God. It has a communal impact. The next part of it is that our sin causes us to miss out on God's blessings. Saul was given multiple chances as king, but he continued to disobey and to not accept God's support. He took his position that was gifted to him by God. He took this for granted and abused it. God had good things planned for Saul. We saw that in the beginning. And he wanted him to succeed. God kept trying and trying with Saul. But Saul's sin made him miss out on what God had in store for him. This again hurt the people around him because that meant that Israel had to suffer too, losing their lives and home in the land that God had blessed them with. So consider how God has been faithful to you to this point in your life. Now consider how your sin may be jeopardizing those things, jeopardizing those blessings. What blessings could you be forfeiting for your sin? And it may not be something tangible like your relationships or your resources or your experience like with your job or anything. It may just be blessings that he can give you in his relationship with him. Our sin can be a blocker to that closeness that we want with God and that he wants with us. Which leads me to my next point, that our sin distances us from a good and faithful Father. Where was God in this chapter? There was no mention of God. I think that's completely intentional. We can learn about his character in this text. Like, how can we learn about his character in this text that doesn't even mention his name? Well, we learn a lot about God's character through the absence of his presence here in this key moment of Israel's history. This was a moment of God's divine judgment on Saul. And unfortunately, that means that Israel as a nation was also impacted by God's judgment. And is that too harsh of God? I don't think so. I mean, when we really think about it, Saul wanted to do things his way, not God's way, and God allowed it. Israel wanted a king to look like the other nations and not have God as their true king, but God still allowed it. In this story, we see that God's judgment is him giving them what they wanted and the consequences of their decisions. Maybe we don't always know what's best for us. Our sin will eventually catch up to us, just like it did with Saul. Saul was supposed to save his people and take care of the Philistines. Again, one of the first things that God had given him to do. But he refused to listen to Yahweh and decided to follow his own path instead. His failure as a king and his refusal to follow Yahweh came back to bite him and led him to his death. And Saul killed himself, not just in this moment, but through his trajectory of his life, leading to this moment. And this is the path that Saul chose, one apart from God, and it led to his death. And we all walk a path. And do you know where that's leading you? But we know that there's reason for hope. That despite our sin, God is still faithful to us. This story is really like a story like that echoes the story of Israel that we see time and time again in the Old Testament, which echoes the story that we see of humanity like time and time again, which echoes our story. And the good news of this is that God still remains faithful to us. From his covenant with Abraham to this new covenant and final covenant that we have through Jesus, we have seen God stay committed to his people despite our failures. And that's honestly one of my favorite things about studying the Old Testament. For me, it breaks down these biases that I have formed about God in the Old Testament. In the past, I might have seen God of the Old Testament be full of wrath and judgment, that he's just the God of angel armies, not the merciful God who keeps giving his people chance after chance after chance. And even though it didn't work out with Saul, and that saddened God, God stayed committed to Israel. He still loves his people. He has a plan for them and will continue to remain faithful to them, though they didn't always deserve it. All right, well, I blew through this. That's all that I have for today. But let's turn to God in prayer. God, thank you for your commitment to us. Even though we often want to do things our own way and we think we know what's best for us, you continue to have patience with us. You are a good father who forgives his children when they mess up and helps us navigate through those consequences of our decisions. Please continue to give us grace as we stumble and sometimes go astray when trying to follow you. Guide us and direct us back to you, because you are the source of truth and the source of life. We thank you for Jesus, who is the best and only true King, who set the example of how to live a life that honors you. Amen.
Thanks for joining us for our sermon podcast. We would love for you to join us on Sunday morning or in one of our small groups during the week, and you can get more information about that at dentonnorthchurch.com.